Good morning and most welcome to 1032. I want today take up one of the Gibsonian successors named Harry Heft, who is at the University of Denison in Granville, Ohio. I think he's interesting for many reasons. There seem to be parallel development within what Gibson was thinking and what we find in Heidegger and Derrida. And this parallelism can be used to get to an understanding of Heidegger. I came to the realization all academian reading that is, so to speak, within the authorized and institutional way of seeing. And I would say a prominent example of that is the Yale method for literary deconstruction or similar things. They do not serve the purpose of neither Derrida or Heidegger, because they making what is open into something mechanical and stable, and they preserve the amnesia, they preserve the metaphysics of presence by turning it into a something, a one of the beings instead of being. But there is a freshness in Gibson. It doesn't establish anything. It is not doing centrism. It seemed to be an open, unbiased investigation into what we are actually doing. And it's odd that had happened in psychology, because psychology is one of the few ventures of knowledge that usually don't go that way. Doesn't seem to like much of experiments or real world examples. This is a complete different turn, and actually Gibson doesn't acknowledge differences in the different subjects. They all need to come from affordances, whether it's anthropology, philosophy, science, or whatever it is. It sounds very healthy to me. Harry Heft maybe has one of the most visual, in a literal sense, explanations of what are affordances. And in this specific article he brings in one of my loved subjects as well, and quite a deal of surprise. I read things that were up that alley, but this is really surprising. This is something unthought of, so to speak. The article has a very long name, but don't get deterred by that, because it's not that difficult at all. Original article is taken from Wiley. Wiley is very hard to get any articles from. It's a very serious publisher, but I managed to have some sort of copy here. It's called Visual Art History and the Psychology of Perception, Perspectivism and its 20th Century Abandonment in the Visual Arts and in Gibson's Ecological Psychology. Yes, that was a handful. Sorry about that. It will get better. It's taking into account the linear perspective that developed in early 15th century. Brunelleschi was one of those people. And 2 centuries later, the very important discovery of retinal image. And this, in combination together with other things, became the cornerstone of an approach to visual perception theory that eventually took shape primarily in the hands of British empiricist philosophers. Even as this approach has dominated perceptual theory to the present day, that perspectivist influence on pictorial representation within visual arts steadily diminished over time. Its decisive break with perspectivism came in the early 20th century, with transformative 19th century changes in the sciences and technology. Yes, it's a connection here. Collectively, these events elevated process and change over fixity and stasis, and ultimately led to the collapse of the distinction between space and time in the physical sciences. Even so, approaches to visual perception in psychology remained remarkably untouched by these occurrences until 1960s, when the experimental psychologist James Gibson drew upon them to challenge the legacy of perspectivism and the visual image and their effect on perceptual theory. His ecological approach to perception recognizes animacy as the essential functional property of living things, and in doing so conceptualizes seeing as a perception action process. From this stance, Gibson's, like the visual artist earlier in the century, rejected the assumption that visual perception is best characterized as the capturing of static images. Jointly and yet independently, both efforts loosen the grip that perspectivism and the visual image have maintained on the arts and on visual perception theory respectively, bringing 19th century advances into 20th century psychological thought. So what is pointed to here is the perspectivism of Brunelleschi with a central perspective, and the idea that the world somehow could be an aesthetic image. Remember the camera oscura he's using to the church in Florence. I forgot the name of the church. And he points it towards the outside of the church and get this reverse image that he projects onto a canvas, and then outlined it with a piece of coal, and that is filled in with paint. That established, so to speak, a static idea of the world, and that three dimensions actually could be a static feature of the world somehow. That later came together with the discovery of the retinal image. The retinal image is something we have the backside of our eyes, and it's actually very similar to what one could find in Brunelleschi. It's a reversed picture on the other side, the back side of the eye, or the back inner side of the eye. That together created the idea that our perception, and to a great extent also reality, is a sort of a static thing in the way it doesn't move, unmovable. And that became the model for science. Of course, that's the Newtonian take. Time in the Newtonian take is something very, very different from space. It's a thing in itself, and we have these words movement, and that becomes movement energy, rörelseenergi, momentum, and such thing. All those later came to be severely questioned in 19th century physics, and that took a indeterminate turn in the 20th century, but it has influenced all sciences, bar none. So oddly enough, even more in psychology than anyone else, because it's not very experimental. It's based on more of hypothesis from the beginning. It's almost as axiomatic as mathematics. Oddly enough, the only experimenter in psychology, Gibson, he changed that picture completely, and he showed that motion is absolutely connected to understanding what a thing is. An example I can give directly is take a cup, put your hand on it. You will not know it's a cup. You will know something about it, but you need to move your hand over the cup. This will not be enough. You need to grasp the whole cup, and if the cup is big, or is a bigger thing like a vase, it will not be enough. If it's big enough, it could be a car, it could be a truck, it could be a house with some odd structure, it could be everything. We need to move around, and that takes time. And then he discovered the same thing as was discovered in science earlier, and that is that 3 dimensions, it's a time-derived thing. It doesn't come just from vision. Our vision cannot see depth without moving the eyes, and we actually need to move ourselves as well. These are the experiments that Gibson made in the 1950s, and those are rather huge discoveries, I would say. I had no idea of the extent of Gibson's experimentation. I have mentioned Gibson before, but now I realized how much it is into experimentation, understanding what is affordances, what is environment. And he tries to avoid the word environment and objects, just like quantum mechanics doesn't like those things, because they are a sort of cover-up for something that needs to be investigated more thoroughly. So this was established in the 17th and 18th centuries with Newtonian scientific and cultural climate of the time. And that sort of gathered together with a pictorial description. Paintings were absolutely super important, so to use exaggeration. But they were actually the spitting image of what reality was. They were always indirectly referred to, even by those who have hardly seen a painting. It became the model, and then when the discovery of the retinal image came, that made the whole thing even stronger. And once you entered into that path, you saw that there was a lack in the visual perception in the retinal image, and then you start thinking that needs to have some addition of calculation. And then I would say in the mid-19th century come the idea of the brain as a calculator of perception, and perception being inadequate, those things. So you see, you go into a whole different path from that start. And then psychology established itself, a science of cognition, early neurology, go even further in that. And I would say that the key point would be that perception is inadequate in some different ways. It's blurred, it doesn't show the proper proportions of things. Houses seem to be squirted or turned in the wrong way. A cube, never looks like a cube should look. So all of a sudden we came further and further away from reality, I would say, to be like inferring Heideggerian thinking that we are not zu Hause anymore. We are not, this is unheimlich. Of course we don't feel at home with this. I would say this is even making a lag coming up, lag being a thing of reality, that people actually wait and try to sort of calculate perception. I didn't see correct. Was that a sort of a turned object? And the idea that there's some ideal, you can see how an ideal object comes in here as well. That's the one that we infer with the sort of not sufficient perception, and then we add things. So the static idea of the retinal image, I think that was the turning point, and then everything went into one direction, and we established even experimental methods to prove that, we'll go into that even further. And that became more and more of a thing. It entered into philosophy, and oddly enough, science was the first area where it was questioned, and the news of that never sort of seeped into the other sciences. So they remained into this idea of the world being static. Let me read something from chapter 2. It's very pertinent here. Chapter 2. Two enduring assumptions about visual perception, explicating the dogma. In spite of the wider variety of approaches to visual perception proposed since the beginning of modern science at the time of the Renaissance, two related assumptions about visual perceptions have endured over time and are cornerstones of the received view. A. What is delivered immediately to the perceiver is a static array of light on the two-dimensional surface on the retina. B. Perceiving individuals receive this projected array of light at a stationary observational point. You have to be completely still. Underlying both these assumptions is the claim that be traced back to antiquity. Visual perception is based on the reception of images. The preceding two assumptions established the agenda for much of perception literature by ushering in several core problems that exist principally as a result of accepting those assumptions. Here we name three of them. 1. If the immediate display of light on our retina is lacking in depth/distance from a stationary point of view, how are we to account for the fact that our perceptual experience is of a world that extends away from us spatially in all directions? 2. Because the perceived size of an object is correlated with its perceived distance. If distance is not immediately available in the array of light projected on the retina at a single observation point, how do we explain the perceived absolute and relative size of objects? And the 3rd, because an object's perceived shape is by definition a three-dimensional object property. If the immediate projected array of light is static and lacking in depth, how do we account for experience of object shapes as opposed to merely object form? Those are three very interesting questions, and just by putting them, they will lead us astray even more if we have that underlying assumption. If we look into the underlying assumption, these questions could actually be quite helpful. So you see, the same set of questions could be helpful in a certain foundation, so to speak, or in a certain historia, as Heidegger would call it. But look deeper into that, those three questions become very, very benign. By looking into them, we can get very interesting answers. And I have to add, I have always thought of it this way. I did not think about those problems before. It's very nice to get surprises after 1,000 lectures. We've been really looking through the literature, and a very nice surprise. It's a happy surprise, and I'm glad it came now, not earlier on. The time is much more ready now. What is the basis for these two taken for granted assumptions that have long been mainstays of inquiry into visual perception? The answer to this question can be found in the history of efforts to understand the nature of vision. Locating this assumption in the history of visual perception theory, and particularly as they arise in relation to development in visual arts, will allow us to gain insight into their origins. Ultimately, doing so will also afford us an opportunity to consider whether these are necessary assumptions for an adequate account of visual perception, or historically contingent ones. Three, perceiving images. There is a long tradition going back to antiquity that vision is based on obtaining images. That is, likeness or idola, end of parenthesis, of things in the world. Before the 12th century, there were two competing accounts on how these images are obtained. First, the extramission approach posited that light rays emanate from the eyes, extending into the world and make contact with the objects of visual perception. By most accounts, this approach can be found initially in the writings of Euclid, who proposed that rectilinear rays are emitted from the eye and travel along divergent paths, making contact with an object's surface. These diverging rays form a visual pyramid or cone, with its vertex at the eye, and importantly for our purposes here, its base on the surface of the object. Euclid exemplifies those theorists whose primary concern was a geometric treatment of optics rather than one of the physical effects of light on the eye, or psychological treatment of vision. It has been suggested that Euclid's treatment of optics was intended primarily as a tool for use in scenography. And then we have Ptolemy, a very hard to pronounce chap. He subsequently and consequently adapted that what may have been primarily an abstract geometric analysis for scenic design to an extramission account of visual perception of objects in the world. Because the base of visual cone positioned as it is on the surface of an object in the world is two-dimensional by definition, the perceived size and shape of an object, both which also require distance information, as we saw above, cannot be explained only with reference to the object properties displayed at the base. Ptolemy proposed that perceived distance is to be attributed to the felt length of the light rays coming from the eyes when they make contact with a materiality compact surface. The felt length and the visual angles subtended by converging light rays to the surface would jointly give rise to perceived size of an object, and perceived shape was due to the form and its orientation detected through the felt distance on the base of the visual cone. So you see here, more and more gets established. We're still in the idea of eyes emitting light or emitting something for perception. This is of course having large consequences on all perception, bar none. And this actually made it possible for me to understand what on earth is the voice of the friend. For the first time I really got into depth of it. And it is like here questions comes up in the head of Ptolemy and they need to be answered. And this is how it progressed. To many accounts is absolutely necessary because of what questions are posed. It's important to remember that there are some questions and that lead the thinking or the interaction into certain ways. Intromission is the other way of going in some ways other, in some ways as it turn out much similar. Intromission is that everything is coming from the outside. And that was based on the claim that objects shed idola, that cross the gap. Idola is the idol, the original. That cross the gap, the air between object and perceiver, impressing themselves on the eye. And according to Democritus, a material facsimile of the object radiates from the object, making contact with the eye. And Aristotle later on account follows this line of thinking, except that transformation of the air by the form, with a big F, of the object, formal causality that is, in Aristotle's view, rather than the transmitted matter, idola as such, makes it possible for the visual sense to take up that form, resulting in its perception. So intromission later becomes more and more prominent, and it's more the feature of the idola coming from the outside. And what features of the idola we get, because if you turn a cube or something similar or a cup, you will see it only in part. So then the idea, because of the question posed, the idea that we need something, an addendum, something supplement, something extra to add to perception, becomes a fact. And I would say that is the event of reflective consciousness, the calculator of perception, the one who makes perception rational, digestible, usable. Because how the questions have been posed during this development leads to indirect limitations, so to speak. And the more we ask those questions, the more we come into that, and in the end we get this externality well established, and it becomes something that cannot be moved anymore or questioned. And the development gets sterner and sterner. It enters into philosophy. It is part of common culture, I would say. And when the event of Newton is so firmly established, it's no longer spoken about anymore. And that enters decisively into the idea of Newton. And I would say that is definitely the reason time and space are two absolutely different things in Newton. And the discovery, or as I would say, invention of movement, because movement becomes necessary somehow, a sort of an outside movement. That outside movement is of course the timeline, going from the XYZ of the spatial dimensions, that extra added thing. So you see, once this is established, everything is thenceforth to, in this specific way, only coming from the outside, and the intermission wins. And today, so much later, that is firmly established beyond talk. And this is, I would say, that's the reason Martin Heidegger brings up etymology as the most important thing, because without that, how could you discover it? You need a genius of Martin Heidegger, and you need etymology. This is extremely helpful, the writing of Harry Heft, to really understand what it's about. Otherwise, the realization would be very hard to get. It would be impossible, I would say. It's surely one of the most interesting things I read in a very long time. And now it for a moment disappeared. Yeah, Kepler is a very good reason. When we start talking also in Kepler and Copernicus, the change, this is something that has been so extremely important that all of a sudden we go from this view of the Earth being in the center of the universe, and we go to the heliocentric view. That loses its power completely if it would lose its power completely if intermission and the idea of idola wasn't surely established by then. And it's extremely interesting. So the shock that came from the heliocentric vision, Copernicus and Kepler and all those, loses its power. I would never have that power as it has, and the decentering or taking away the centeredness of human beings that happened doesn't make any sense if you look into how perception actually works. Sorry about that, mates. It's just extraordinarily interesting. It's and then we go into the invention of the artificial perspective. And here it's very, very important to establish the distinction between an artificial perspective and a natural perspective. And this is so often conflated in literature of modern perceptual psychology, and I would say it's conflated definitely in ordinary language, which makes for incredible problems when it comes to philosophy. Beginning with the latter, the application of Euclidean geometry for the purpose of describing the path of light rays between the individual's eye and the object perceived is properly referred to as a natural perspective. It is attributable to the layout of the environment and the objects in the field of view that can be perceived from a particular point of observation. Among the most commonly cited examples of it today are the parallel rectilinear edges of train tracks appearing to narrow as they recede into the distance. When you look at train tracks, they narrow and go almost in together to make the illusion. I like that illusion. This is how it's been presented to me from the early age. I think I was like 12 when I saw this illusion, as it was called, about the train tracks. It's not an illusion. In this case, there is a gradual reduction in the visual angle projected from any two adjacent points on the parallel edges of the path to the eye of a stationary perceiver. Because this visual pattern is to features in the environment taken in relation to the position of the perceiver, one could say there is nothing in original perspectiva theory that have anything to do with the visual arts. That is, we are not referring here to a technique for transforming the appearance of the environment onto a flat surface, but rather offering a geometric analysis of environmental layout along the lines of sight. And this is two incredibly different things, and I'm starting to understand that. With that in mind, natural perspective is to be distinguished from the technique that was developed and put into wide practice beginning in the 14th century to create the appearance, and this is important, of depth on a flat surface, a technique properly called artificial perspective. Historians are in agreement that artificial perspective techniques were developed by Brunelleschi for artistic purposes to display or represent depth on a flat surface. Though natural perspective is a result of an application of human invention, namely geometry, to the perceived layout of the environment, artificial perspective is a wholly human invention from start to finish. I would think you would strand into enormous problems if you were to conflate this. And I would say there is, in common language, and me, until I read this article, I conflated that as well. And I've been painting for at least 12 years and been dealing with artificial perspective and natural perspective all the time. And I always conflated them. And this is made even more obvious by the development of photography, which I'm using here, which is also using that sort of method, so to speak. And it's easy to fall into that trap. I would say it's inevitable. So this is a huge key to the understanding of what is going on really, what is really happened, to go into the investigation. I would say it would be impossible to do that without this piece of information. This is so interesting, so I'm going to take a continuation of this. I'm going to make this still a lecture by its own, 10:32, but I will continue and I will mention when it's time the next. And I try to put in a link into this article as well. It's definitely a recommendable read. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.